Well, good afternoon. Thank you for being here at this session. I'm John Bauer. I'm president of East Central College. I'm a graduate of Jefferson College, and I'm happy to talk to you today about the history of community colleges in Missouri. I hope, anyway, after this presentation, you have a little bit of context for why the community colleges we have are here, why we're organized the way we are, and I really think that is important for anyone who works in this sector. If we don't know our own story, then you really lose something, whether that's true at our institutions or it's true for our sector, or even understanding kind of the history of higher education across the United States. And as I was thinking about this, it's been a number of years since I spoke on this topic, but I'll just mention a couple of things maybe to illustrate that point. We have a lot of people who come into the community college sector in Missouri, and perhaps from other states, or perhaps this is work early in your career. If you are 30 or younger, you've only been alive when we've had 12 community colleges in Missouri. That wasn't always the case, but I mean, if you're under 30, that's true. And if you look at it more from your career, I would say if you're 50 or younger, you've only worked professionally in that kind of dynamic. But that wasn't always the case in Missouri. In fact, the community colleges in Missouri weren't even organized the way they are or had the authority that we have now. So that's I think one reason, knowing our story. It's important to know that each state is different. So what I'm going to talk about is how things have come to be in Missouri. If you've worked in other states, you know that each state is unique. Not every state has elected trustees, for example. In some states, community colleges are organized by counties, and it may be the county commission or the equivalent that funds the institution. That's not true in Missouri. So you'll see some differences and maybe some explanation why community colleges in Missouri are the way they are. And then finally, I think it just illustrates the fact that, there can be long-lasting impacts when committees and task forces and other groups are formed. Many of you have been on committees, certainly at your institution, but maybe even outside of your institution. And sometimes there may be a question of, is this going to lead to anything meaningful? And I think you'll see in this case, starting at the national level and then filtering down to the state level and ultimately to the local level, that kind of work really can have lasting impact, and it led to the creation of the system of community colleges we have today. In terms of maybe some delimitations, I'll tell you right away, there are people in the room from each of the 12 institutions who know your own history better than I do. I'm not an expert on any one of the 12. I know East Central pretty well. But you know your institution better than I do. I'm also not going to cover the history of every institution. It's really more kind of a global perspective or a statewide perspective on the institutions that we have. Here are just some shots, some representative shots. I asked each of the institutions to send me some early pictures. And in some cases, the early pictures go way back, way back. The women's basketball team from what's now Metropolitan, but it was the Polytechnic Institute in Kansas City. That's the upper right. And St. Charles, one of our newer, one of the kids in the group, that's an early photo from St. Charles. Lower left is the bookstore at East Central when we were in temporary facilities in Union, and the facility we did everything in that facility, and that's the true many institutions, starting in temporary facilities that maybe had to serve as a bookstore, admissions office, classrooms, labs, everything. And if memory serves, I hope this is right, upper left is the student council from North Central in Trenton, what was then Trenton Junior College. I hope possibly that's Mineral Area. I apologize if I've got that wrong. Is it Mineral Area? My apologies. I was going on memory to get some of the shots that aren't identified, and then all of a sudden I was drawing a blank. So we'll talk about the pivot point on this is really the 1961, the Enabling Act that led to the formation of community colleges in Missouri as we know it now. How that legislation came about, some of the provisions because it explains why we're organized the way we are, and then some outcomes. I have a few stories of individuals along the way as well. So it really began, I can back it up even further. This is Elmer Ellis. He's was president of the University of Missouri. If you're familiar with the Mizzou campus, Ellis Library, that's President Ellis. And when asked about the formation of community colleges, he pointed back to the State Commission on Education beyond the high school. That really led to the formation, led to the development of the enabling law, and then the formation of the community colleges we have today. That commission was the result. There's an even stronger Missouri connection, really goes back to President Truman. He created or established a President's Commission in 1947, and among the recommendations from that commission, one, that there should be the development of junior colleges. In fact, that commission went on to use the term community colleges, probably the first time on any kind of national stage that community colleges were referred to, not junior colleges. And called for the development of a system of community colleges across the country. The Eisenhower administration took that up, encouraged states to then appoint commissions and really take that charge and run with it, and that's exactly what happened in Missouri. So Governor Blair, who's shown here in 1957, took that challenge from President Eisenhower, appointed the statewide Governor's Council on Education beyond the high school. It was really, again, a function of the President's Council from 1947, and that was co-chaired by President Ellis at University of Missouri and Father Reinert, who was then president at St. Louis University, and that group began meeting in 1958. But it's not like there were no community colleges or junior colleges at that time. There actually were several. The original was Kansas City Polytechnic Institute, established in 1915. It later became the Junior College of Kansas City and then ultimately Metropolitan Community College. I'll talk about the formation of Metropolitan in a few moments. That was 1915. So Metropolitan can claim, obviously, to be the first community college, junior college in Missouri, and one of the first in the country. Joliet was the first in the country, is recognized as the first community college, but Kansas City Polytechnic, then later the Junior College of Kansas City, followed very shortly thereafter, run by the school board, the Kansas City School Board, and that's how all of these institutions were operated at that time. Then came Flat River Junior College, established in 1922. That's now Mineral Area. Trenton Junior College, established in 1925, now North Central, and then Moberly Junior College, established in 1927, and now it's Moberly Area Community College. All of these were operated by their respective school districts. Let me grab my notes here. I was surprised, and I think perhaps you will be too, in 1929, so this is a couple of years after Moberly was formed, but just to take a point in time, I'll give you the over-under, and you just give me a sense of what you think of the room. The over-under, the 15 is the over-under. Do you think there were more than 15 public junior colleges in Missouri, or under 15 at that time? These are the ones that survived, but at the peak, how many would you, over 15 or under? It was over. There were 23 public junior colleges in 1929. All of them operated by school districts, and many of them did not survive. Ultimately, they would be closed by the school district, either too expensive, not enough students. But 23 public junior colleges. That doesn't count the private junior colleges that were in existence at the same time. Those are just the public junior colleges operated by the school districts. Fortunately for you, I have some pretty pictures to share along the way, so you don't have to look at text. So this is the original Metropolitan. It began as Kansas City Polytechnic at 11th and Locust. That was formerly Central High School in Kansas City. It was known colloquially as just junior college, and it would actually change to the Junior College of Kansas City in 1919, still operated by the Kansas City School Board at that time, and that would be true until 1964. And at that point, then, the Metropolitan District was formed beyond just the Kansas City School District. I think at that point, then, it was 7 different school districts that combined to form Metropolitan. So that's the original, the first in Missouri, the first public junior college in Missouri, and one of the first in the country. Flat River Junior College, established in 1922. Dr. Gilgore is here. You just celebrated, not him personally, the institution celebrated 100 years. He looks great for 100. You'd never know. But his institution, the institution he serves, just celebrated 100 years. Flat River Junior College, established in 1922, and this is one of the early looks at what became Mineral Area. North Central, this is a picture of the first graduating class, pretty similar to how our students dress today. Trenton Junior College, established in 1925. They look so happy. Such a joyous group. And then Moberly. This building, the institution was established in 1927. The original campus built a few years later in 1935, and this building is still used today in Moberly and houses the administration offices and other functions at the institution. So these were those institutions that not only were formed well before the Enabling Act, but they persisted into the 1960s and obviously beyond. So, for these institutions, there was no state funding. There was no state plan or coordination for junior colleges. Again, these were functions of the school districts, and they were just established locally as extensions of the high school. In fact, as I was reading about Kansas City Polytechnic, what was happening is many students were going to a 5th year of high school, so they could begin to get some college credit, and the school board decided they would formalize that and created Kansas City Polytechnic. So back to the Governor's Council that was formed. So the Truman Commission called for the states to take this charge. The governor of Missouri did that, established a committee to look at the desirability of recommending a state plan for junior colleges. And I'll continue to use the terminology that was used at the time. You know, we don't use the term junior college anymore, but that was the language at the time of this committee and of the enabling statute. And the group made a recommendation that a state structure should be established because there was this need for college-trained people, and they could see demographically there would be a large increase in the number of high school graduates. Going back to the recommendations from this first committee, they recommended state control of the junior colleges. As things develop, there is some oversight, but the control really rests with the local board. It was recommended that the state control the location of new junior colleges. There was concern that a junior college be viable, and they wanted to make sure that the state had some measure of assuming that or ensuring that there was an appropriate tax base, the critical mass of population, that if a junior college was established, it was actually going to grow and to thrive. That existing state agencies be used and procedures where appropriate, and that there be state assistance at least equal on a per pupil basis to the aid for secondary schools. Didn't quite reach that, but that was the recommendation from this group. On that third bullet point, just a note, because it did end up becoming, in a de facto way, what's happened in Missouri, not so much using the existing state agencies, although that may have happened, but existing procedures. Many of the laws that affect community colleges are identical to public school laws, and that's why, for example, when we do a bond issue, we follow the same statute that a school district does. At the time we were established, we were 6-member boards, just like school districts. So often where there's no controlling statute for a community college, it defaults back not to higher ed law, but to public school law in Missouri. And this is in part because of this recommendation that existing procedures, including legislation that was on the books, be used to govern the community college system in Missouri. So the final report in 1960 called for better support for existing colleges and universities generally. I'm going to skip bullet 2 and come back to it. Recommended the establishment of a state scholarship plan, establishment of state loans to students, oversight of diploma mills to make, and actually the goal was to abolish diploma mills, and also made a recommendation that a commission on higher education, what became later the Coordinating Board for Higher Education, and today the Missouri Department of Higher Ed and Workforce Development, be formed. Those happened later. But the second bullet point, the state aid for a system of public junior colleges, became the first major item that came out of this group. This committee, by the way, first started talking about community colleges in Missouri about 1.5 miles from here. Remember, it was Father Reinert and President Ellis at Mizzou who co-chaired that group. They were meeting at SLU 1.5 miles from here when the detailed discussion about a recommendation about junior colleges be formed in Missouri. That took place right here in St. Louis at St. Louis University. One thing that's interesting is you read these reports, and I might even read a couple of sections here because the more things change, the more they stay the same. Some of the rationale for the community colleges that were formed could be written about today. The state has a growing need for college-trained people at the degree level. An expanded junior college program enabling many more capable young people to get the first 2 years of college at minimum expense, and to increase the number of individuals, persons completing degree programs. A great need for skilled workers, technicians, semi-professional people at less than the degree level, meaning at that time less than a bachelor's degree, and a system of colleges that could offer technical programs to train people. I mean, you could take that language, update it just minimally, and we were facing the same issues in Missouri today. So much has changed, but some things do remain the same. And here again, the co-chairs of the group. This was the recommendation that went to the governor then in late 1960, with President Ellis on the left, Father Reinert on the right. So, next item was to really take this and start to develop the legislation, the statute that would govern community colleges. Subcommittee was held in Jesse Hall, and then a recommendation that the two co-chairs then form a committee to actually draft the legislation to be presented to the General Assembly. Let me stop and make a couple of points here about this group. First of all, they were meeting in Jesse Hall, which is interesting. Again, if you go back to the University of Missouri, you're familiar with Jesse Hall, kind of the iconic structure there, president of the University of Missouri. President Jesse was friends and professional colleagues with William Rainey Harper, who in the late 1800s first called for what became, the junior college model, and really identified lower division coursework, upper division coursework, really considered the father of the community or junior college movement. And President Jesse made the same recommendation in the late 1800s for the state of Missouri. So coincidental that this meeting was held in Jesse Hall. One of the participants at this meeting was a young graduate student named Charles McLean. Charles McLean was originally from St. Clair, Missouri, in our area near East Central, just a few miles from the campus. He started teaching school in a one-room schoolhouse in Sullivan at the age of 16, and ultimately became he attended this meeting, this subcommittee meeting, one of about 30 people attending this meeting. He was a graduate student at Mizzou at the time. Later, he became the founding president at Jefferson College. He was then the president at Northeast Missouri State, now Truman, and then later in his career became the commissioner of higher education in Missouri. He was a young graduate student at this meeting in Jesse Hall. So, the language is developed. Senate Bill 7 is introduced. This is the 1961 session of the Missouri General Assembly, and it was ultimately then passed into law. This is kind of the pivot point. So with this legislation now, there was a mechanism for local communities to establish community colleges that didn't exist previously. And this also explains why we're organized the way we are. The statute provided that junior college districts could be formed out of school districts. That's why our districts don't follow county boundaries, they don't follow city boundaries, or any other jurisdiction other than school district boundaries. In our case, East Central is a combination of 10 school districts. Every institution here is a combination of some number of school districts. That's how we could be formed. It provided the ability to levy a local tax, provided state aid of $200 a year per FTE, could be created with a simple majority of the voters in the proposed district, and at the same time, a board of trustees, a 6-member board would be elected, which is the same as school board. Now, school districts later had the option to expand to 7-member districts. Most of them have done that, not all of them. But in Missouri, 11 of the 12 of us have 6-member districts. Just a few years ago, legislation was created that applied at that time only to St. Louis Community College for a 7th member to be appointed. So St. Louis has a 7-member district, or 7-member board, excuse me. The rest of us have 6-member districts. It's interesting if you talk to those from other states and we start talking about maybe the size of your boards. They're surprised, first of all, a 6-member board is kind of on the small side. In many states, a board may be 15 members or even larger. Also, they are often surprised that we have an even number, because typically with public boards you'd have an odd number just to prevent the possibility of a tie, but it still persists. Trustees are elected 6-year terms, which is also unusual. And it was done in a way so that when the original board was elected, you could stagger those terms with the top 2 vote getters getting 6-year terms, the next 2 getting 4-year terms, and then 2 years, and that's how that persists to this day. I believe, I don't know this to be certain, but I have never found another political jurisdiction that has a 6-year term. U.S. senators do, but in terms of a political subdivision, members of city council will typically be 2-year terms. County offices, 4-year terms. Other types of taxing districts, school districts, 3-year terms. Nobody else has a 6-year term. It also enabled the State Board of Education. Remember, there's no CBHE, no Department of Higher Ed at this time, so it was the State Board of Education, same entity that controlled the school districts, to establish the role of 2-year colleges, supervise the public junior colleges, establish standards for those districts, and be responsible for accreditation of each junior college under its supervision. Ultimately, some of these duties, in some fashion or another, perhaps not with these precise, not with this precise language, but the role shifted to the Department of Higher Ed, what was then called the Coordinating Board for Higher Education, a few years later. Originally, the Department of Higher Ed was called the Coordinating Board, and then it hasn't been all that long that we designated the board is the Coordinating Board. The individuals who serve on that board, the department is just that, the Department of Higher Ed. This was interesting. So after the session, and again, the more things change, the more they remain the same. Sometimes after a legislative session, you can look back at what the General Assembly did and you just wonder if anything worthwhile was accomplished, first of all, or was any harm done, and sometimes you worry about that. But occasionally, and probably more often than we want to admit, some really significant work is done that has long-lasting impact. This was the Columbia Missourian in May of 1961. After the legislature was finished, after the law was passed, the junior college may become the most notable achievement to come out of the 1961 legislature, and I think that's proven to be true. What happened in Missouri really reflects what was happening across the country, and I hope this illustrates. So prior to 1960, frankly, most states were doing this same work at about the same time, late 50s, early 60s. So this is a look. We had 412 junior colleges at the time, 82 of those which had been established in the 1950s, so still relatively recent. But in 1960, this was the landscape of junior colleges across the country. That's 1970. Nearly 1,000 community colleges just in that 10-year period. At East Central, I often talk about, when we get on this topic, I'll talk about the explosion of community colleges that was happening. That's really true. We were opening community colleges at the rate of about 50 a year, or about one a week. That was the pace. We didn't open a new one literally every week, but that's how many during this time were being established. 500, nearly 500, 497 community colleges established between 1961 and 1970. So when we talk about opening a new junior college once a week in the 60s, this is the period of time that we're talking about. It's also why so many of us, so many of the institutions today are about the same age, give or take a few years. So we had an explosion across the country. This illustrates, you can see a relatively small number, a little bit larger in the 20s. Remember, we had 23, these not just in Missouri, but across the country, were outgrowths of school districts. There's the explosion in the 60s, a few more in the 70s, and then it starts to tail off. I tried to find updated figures for the last 20 years by decade, and I was unable to find that. There are still occasionally community colleges that are formed, and there was one formed in California last year, but it's very small compared to what you see here. In fact, there was a researcher, it's pretty well known in community college literature, who in the 1960s said if we get to a system of about 1,200 community colleges, that would be a mature system. At that point, a significant number of people in the United States would live within easy driving distance of a community college. And that's proven to be true. When we got a little bit north of 1,000, the growth in community college really started to slow. And these are the institutions that were formed as a result of that enabling act. The first out of the gate was St. Louis Community College. In fact, it was a political action committee in St. Louis that was probably most responsible for finally getting the legislation across the finish line. Then Crowder in 1964, Jefferson in 1964, Metropolitan, I mentioned before, had been Kansas City Polytechnic, then the Junior College District, or the Junior College of Kansas City. In 1964, the other school districts were brought in to form the Metropolitan District. Then State Fair, Three Rivers, East Central in 1968. So that's the 60s generation. And since then, we've had two, St. Charles in 1986 and OTC in 1990. This is an early view of the St. Louis Community College campus. 1962, as I said, there was a political action group in St. Louis that really deserves a lot of credit for getting that enabling legislation. In fact, there were two women who were part of that group who were the real drivers in that effort to make sure that the legislation actually did get across the finish line, signed into law. These aren't just pictures of buildings. I do have people. This is the original board at Crowder, created in 1964. Another interesting thing, you probably know this, but Crowder used to be Camp Crowder. And the public decided they really wanted to make good use of what had been a military base, and at the same time that the possibility of creating a community college then was put into law, then what was Camp Crowder was purchased. So this is a look back when it was a military base and is now the campus of Crowder College. Jefferson College, created 1964. I mentioned Charles McLean again. Really remarkable that he ended up becoming then the first president of Jefferson College, and then went on to have a career that spanned over 60 years, including the founding of Jefferson College in 1964. State Fair. This is an early look. So the district was formed in 1966. There was a great push to get some buildings up as quickly as possible. So temporary facilities, we had a couple of these ourselves at East Central. Temporary facilities were created in 1968. Within a couple of years, I believe, Dr. Bates. You can see those here. They remained in place, these temporary facilities, for about 20 years or so. That's the nature. Ours are still in use from the early 1980s. And so Plywood U became the moniker for State Fair before a permanent campus was built. Three Rivers Junior College, 1966. and then East Central in 1968, the last of the 60s generation that mirrored that national trend. And this is an early look at the construction of the campus. For the first couple of years, as I said, like many institutions, we were in temporary facilities in Union as the campus was being constructed. This is phase one. The first structure on the campus is that water tower, which stood until just a couple of years ago and finally had to come down. But that was the first permanent structure on what is now the campus in Union. Then we had a gap of about 18 years, and there were no new community colleges formed until St. Charles was formed in 1986. So it was the first new community college. This is a look at the construction at that time. Interestingly, and I believe I'm confident of this, he's the only person who has done this. Dr. Don Shook became the first president at St. Charles. He was the founding president at East Central. So as far as I can determine in Missouri, he's the only president to have been a founding president at two different institutions. He was one of the first, he was the second president at Crowder, but not truly the founding president. The original president was hired and after a very short time had to resign because of illness, and Dr. Shook then took that role. So a lot of the work that would otherwise fall to a founding president rested with him and his staff and the original faculty at Crowder, but he wasn't the founding president. But he was our founding president. He was the founding president at St. Charles, and there are buildings on each campus in his honor. He lives today in the Kansas City area. And then the last of the community colleges to date, established in 1990, Ozarks Technical College in Springfield. At the time, Springfield, Missouri was the largest metropolitan statistical area in the country that did not have a community college. They were formed in 1990, the last one formed, and I'm told that as the issue was on the ballot not long before the election, Zenith closed its plant, talking to Dr. Higdon about this history. Zenith closed, thousands of individuals laid off, and there is the prevailing wisdom if that had not happened, that election may or may not have passed. Now, there probably would have been subsequent tries, but with those layoffs, the public recognizing there was a need, then the issue passed and the district was formed in 1990. So another early view of OTC, the last one formed in Missouri. There have been a couple of attempts or discussions. There was a proposal for a community college in the Lake of the Ozarks many years ago for a new institution. There was discussion within the last couple of years about a 13th community college down in southeast Missouri, but none of those have materialized. OTC, the last one formed in the state. So these are the community colleges today, not our taxing districts, but our service regions. The taxing districts, as you know, only represent a relatively small part of the land mass, but with the service regions, then we cover every inch of the state, either in district or out of district. We serve the residents across the state, north, south, east, west, and those are the 12 that you see today. And this is the community college system. So if you remember the line from before, the map from before that showed where we were in 1970, there have been a few, about 50 or so in the decades of the 90s, and a relatively small number since then. So, you know, we're at around that 1,100 mark. We actually have a little bit less than that today as some districts have been consolidated. But you can see here graphically the growth of that system that was first envisioned by President Truman and his administration in the late 1940s. And a few random shots again of some of the institutions around, and I think I love the headline from the Roadrunner at State Fair, because I think this headline could have been written in all 12 districts at one point in time. Dreams come true as college opens. I know that was certainly true in our area. St. Charles under construction is at the lower left. Upper right, view of student body from St. Louis Community College. Lower right, Metropolitan. And the upper left and upper right construction in the upper left at East Central, and the model that you see in the upper center represents how the campus at East Central was envisioned to develop over time. I included that because if you would look at the campus today, it looks very similar, but not identical. And I think that's true of all of our institutions, whether you're going all the way back to what was envisioned for Kansas City Polytechnic or the community colleges formed in the 60s or the more recent ones. There was certainly a vision. It didn't happen in every community. There are only 12 of us. The vision is probably pretty common among the institutions, but the specific plans for each of the institutions has changed over time. It's not exactly what we envisioned, and that would be true if you look just at the model of the campus, and I really mean it in a larger sense than that, not just the physical buildings, but the institutions that we have become. We're not exactly what was envisioned, but we're certainly meeting the goal that was laid out. And I think, yes, that's it. So I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope that provides some context for you and maybe explains a little bit about not only your institution and its place within the system, but how we developed to where we are today. It's an interesting story, and I think a couple of the takeaways are, one, some of this committee work really does matter. It would have been easy. There were many points along the way where there could have been a report that was put on the proverbial shelf and then never looked at again, and community colleges wouldn't have developed. It would have been easy, frankly, if you back it up to the Truman Commission. There are lots of commissions that are established that make recommendations and then nothing ever happens. But occasionally something happens, and this has long-reaching effect. I think that resonates today. There was a bill passed last session that called for the state to look at the funding model for community colleges. And there's a group that's actively working right now. This could end up, I don't know how this plays out, but it could be a fundamental shift in how community colleges, and not just community colleges, but all of higher ed is funded. I don't know how this will play out, but as many times as we can become cynical about committees and task forces like that, there are also examples where they have real impact and long-lasting impact. So I'm happy to answer questions you may have. I'll try to answer, but I can guarantee you I'm not the expert of your institution. Yes, sir.
We changed the name from junior college to community college because of the negative connotation. A few years back, and I don't remember the gentleman's name, he was a board member from State Fair, I think. He was leading in charge to get the name changed from MCCA to MCAA because we're not a junior college. Why would we have that
Yeah. I don't know, and I don't know that that's an active discussion now. NJCAA is one of the few places you'll still see that term used in a formal way. There may be others, but that's probably the biggest one. It's interesting, though, you said that because that happened, I'll just speak for East Central, and it happened in other places. So we were East Central Junior College, and around 1980 decided just to become East Central College, and the language, even from the board minutes at that time, the intent was to represent the comprehensive nature of the college, and it wasn't just the junior college, the transfer model, but it was career and technical programs, other things that the college did. But there are others who will say, although I think the move away from junior college is widely accepted, others have very strong feelings that the word community should stay in the name because it's reflective of the mission as opposed to, XYZ college as opposed to community college. There are two East Centrals in the United States. One is in Mississippi. It's East Central Community College, and then there's East Central College in Union, just two examples of that difference in name. Yes, ma'am.
Has the funding models remained the same as in 1960?
No. In fact, so you saw the recommendation and an establishment of 200 per FTE. We're not funded on an FTE basis now. It's kind of a snapshot in time of maybe how enrollment is something that the presidents have spent a lot of time on, how to equitably finance and fund institutions, because we grow at different rates. So if you take a snapshot in the early 90s and you divide the state money by the enrollment at that time, well, institutions like OTC and St. Charles and others have grown very rapidly, and others have maybe stayed flat or even declined. But it is not an FTE model. And it could be that some variation of this new funding model is more closely tied to enrollment. Other states, it's nearly all that. You know, as your enrollment goes up or down, your funding goes up or down. It affects tuition, but it doesn't affect state aid directly. Yes, sir.
You mentioned that the community colleges here are set up like other states where there's one system. Could you find why they did not set it up like that, and then also talk about how MCCA helps with that?
Yeah, it was it's a state decision. Each state approached it very differently. In some states, they were formed really as part of the university system. For example, Georgia, that's the case, where the community colleges are part of the University of Georgia system, and in some. To some degree, that's a result of those who were involved with creating the system all came from the university system. And so it became a state-by-state decision. There are states that have local autonomous districts like Missouri does, and others that is part of a system. There are states where the equivalent of the Department of Higher Ed, really coordinates a system. They may not be part of the university system, but they are a coordinated system with oversight at the state level. There are other states, again, like Missouri, that have the autonomous districts. So it is truly a state-by-state decision at that time. I forgot the second part of your question. Oh, so MCCA was formed in the mid-1970s. I'm going to forget the year, and it was just a recognition among the 10 institutions at that time that there needed to be some sort of organization to help support the community college. It started with a part-time director. Coincidentally, that part-time director was part-time in quotes because it ended up being a full-time role, but one of the administrators at East Central actually served as that full-time, or that director at the time, and then it became clearly a full-time position. Obviously advocates for public policy issues, and that's one of the primary roles, but also provides professional development like we have here today, helps become kind of that clearinghouse for information among the institutions, especially because we're not a system, we're not a statewide system, we're 12 entities, and so it provides a valuable role that way. Yes, ma'am. She's my boss. I'll take her and come back to you. You just knew that. Yes.
Next year, MCCA will meet in Kansas City. After seeing the picture of the very first college, I wonder how close we'll be located. I know we're going to a hotel.
Honestly, I don't know about, does anybody from Metropolitan know, does the building still stand, or you don't think it stands? It's okay. I don't know how close we are to 11th and Locust exactly, but I'm told, and I believe, because he knows everything, the building is gone. Right, Todd? Everything, yeah. Ma'am? Yeah.
I was just going to ask, having immersed yourself in all this history, what do you think are like the two best lessons to take from the history into the future?
Well, one, that this kind of work does have impact. I'll be honest with you. I think many of us in the room have been in this situation. You get asked to serve on a committee, even outside. Just take it outside, not the committee at your institution. And, maybe there's just a cynical part that says, I'll do this, it's important, but what's really going to happen? Sometimes things really happen, and they have long-lasting impact. And so I think it's dangerous to be cavalier about that. And then also, I just think I think it shows the power of vision. I spoke recently to our municipal league in Franklin County, and my remarks focused on the vision that those in the East Central area, mostly Franklin County, surrounding areas, the vision they had in the 1960s to see the need and to really make it happen. So, remember, it started at the federal level, then the state level, but ultimately it comes down to a local decision, people who would carry petitions, get it on the ballot, and get the issue passed to make that a reality. When I was reading about Charles McLean, a funny story about that. So after Jefferson College was formed, before they had a campus, before they even had a site for a campus, they were formed. He was hired. There was one secretary, terminology at the time, and it was in DeSoto at a Rotary Club meeting and said, you have no students, you have no buildings, are you really worth $18,000 a year? That was his question at the DeSoto Rotary Club. And his impact has been far-reaching. But his successor, Dr. Henry, said upon his death that one thing that Dr. McLean could see was that big picture and see not just what Jefferson College, and you could just substitute any community college because the same story is true in each of the 12, not just what it was that day or what it could become in a couple of years, what it could become down the road. And I think the power of that vision is an example that we ought to figure out how to replicate. It's remarkable, really, that people had that foresight. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Does the state see a need for any additional community colleges?
I'll let Dr. Gilgore answer that. What's interesting in Missouri, it really does originate at the local level. So there's local interest in having a community college, and sometimes the answer is an area can best be served by an existing community college. That's really how the service regions came into effect. Those were drawn by a committee of the presidents and chancellors at the time, recognizing that not every place in the state had a community college, and yet everybody in the state could benefit. Every region of the state could benefit from a community college. And I think that service region concept has really probably served the state pretty well. But I also can see there could be a time where there is population growth in an area, in a concentrated area, that could support a community college. And if the voters were willing to do that, there's nothing magical about 12. I think what has happened is it's a function of where the population centers are, where there's been local support already, and areas that are being well served by the community colleges. So, is it possible that there will be others? I think it is possible. But I think those questions have to be answered first.
So I guess when, for like example, ECC has our main campus in Union, and then we have another campus in Broward. When did that really start taking off? That it is still that district or that school, but all these different sites from the Moberly and Columbia as well, because that's a huge space. When did those kind of start?
And there is a mechanism for adding to the districts. OTC has done this a couple of times. Metropolitan has done this. And again, it's a question of if voters are interested, it can go on the ballot and they can vote to join an existing district and expand the boundaries. And so that could happen in some of these remote locations or remote sites, distant sites where there's a presence. And whether it will happen, I'm sure. Actually, I think that's probably more likely than a 13th community college. What's more likely is you'll see existing community colleges at different times expand the taxing district boundaries. And I think that's a more likely scenario than formally establishing or having established a 13th community college. And it's just a question of getting on the ballot and winning that voter support, simple majority. Other questions? I hope I'm close to on time. Not bad. All right, well, thank you very much. If you're interested in more detail, give me your card. I can send you all of the proof to my story.